What can we expect from another African leader? Putin was thinking before his meeting with Ibrahim Traoré, until he realized that Traoré's proposal could single-handedly solve Russia's economic crisis. The snow fell heavily on Red Square as Ibrahim Traoré's motorcade approached the Kremlin gates on that December morning in 2023. Inside the armored vehicle, the young Burkina Faso president reviewed his notes one final time, knowing that the next few hours would either establish Africa as an equal partner in global affairs or confirm the continent's continued marginalization in the eyes of major powers. Vladimir Putin stood at the window of his office in the Senate Palace, watching the African delegation's arrival with the detached interest of someone who had hosted hundreds of foreign leaders over his 2 decades in power. To him, this was likely another routine meeting with yet another African president seeking Russian investment, military cooperation, or simply the prestige of a Kremlin photo opportunity. Putin's aide, Dmitry Volkov, approached with a briefing file on Ibrahim Traoré. Mr. President, the Burkina Faso delegation has arrived. According to our intelligence, Traoré is requesting a meeting to discuss strategic partnership and mutual economic development. Putin barely glanced at the file. Another African leader with big dreams and small resources, he muttered, straightening his tie. How long is this scheduled to last? 1 hour, sir. The Foreign Ministry has prepared standard talking points about Russian-African friendship and potential cooperation agreements. Good. Let's get this over with. What Putin didn't know was that Ibrahim Traoré had spent months preparing for this moment. Unlike the typical diplomatic courtesy calls that characterize most African leaders' visits to Moscow, Traoré was coming with a proposal that would fundamentally challenge Putin's assumptions about Africa's place in the global economy. The meeting began in Putin's private office, a room designed to intimidate with its soaring ceilings, ornate decorations, and massive desks positioned to make visitors feel small and supplicant. Putin gestured for Traoré to sit in the chair across from him, maintaining the psychological advantage that had served him well in countless negotiations with world leaders. President Traoré, Putin began in his characteristic monotone. Welcome to Moscow. I understand you're interested in strengthening ties between Russia and Burkina Faso. The slight pause before naming the country suggested his minimal familiarity with it. Traoré smiled calmly. President Putin, thank you for receiving me. I've come to discuss how Africa can help Russia overcome its current economic challenges while establishing a partnership based on genuine mutual benefit. Putin's eyebrows rose slightly. Most African leaders began such meetings by asking for assistance, aid, investment, or military support. This was the first time in recent memory that an African president had offered to help Russia solve its problems. I'm intrigued, Putin said, leaning back in his chair. What exactly are you proposing? Traoré opened his briefcase and placed a folder on Putin's desk. Mr. President, Russia is currently facing unprecedented economic sanctions that have reduced your GDP by 12% and limited your access to global financial markets. Your energy exports, while still substantial, are being sold at significant discounts due to Western restrictions. Putin's expression hardened slightly. He wasn't accustomed to foreign leaders, particularly from countries he considered economically insignificant, lecturing him about Russia's economic situation. At the same time, Traoré continued, Africa possesses 60% of the world's arable land, 30% of global mineral reserves, and a growing population of 1.4 billion people who represent an enormous market for Russian goods and services. Yet our continent remains marginalized in global trade, largely due to Western-imposed financial systems and trading relationships. Putin opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside. What he saw made him sit up straighter in his chair. The first document was a comprehensive analysis of Russia's economic vulnerabilities, compiled by a team of African economists who had studied at top universities in Moscow, Beijing, and London. The analysis was more thorough and insightful than many reports produced by Russian government agencies. The second document outlined Africa's untapped economic potential in terms that Putin, as a former KGB officer with a keen understanding of geopolitical strategy, could immediately appreciate. It detailed how African resources and markets could provide Russia with alternatives to Western economic relationships. But it was the third document that truly captured Putin's attention: a specific proposal for a $20 billion economic alliance between Russia and a coalition of African nations, with Burkina Faso serving as the coordinating hub. "This is interesting," Putin admitted, his tone shifting from condescending to genuinely curious. "But how exactly would this work? Burkina Faso's economy is small," Traoré finished. "Yes, individually our economies are modest, but collectively, the African nations I represent in this proposal have a combined GDP of $2.8 trillion and foreign reserves exceeding $400 billion. Putin looked up from the documents. "You represent other nations?" "President Putin, I didn't come here just as the leader of Burkina Faso. Over the past 6 months, I've been building a coalition of African leaders who share a vision of genuine South-South cooperation. 12 countries have already committed to this initiative, with others expressing strong interest." Traoré pulled out his phone and showed Putin a series of signed letters from African heads of state endorsing the proposal. Putin recognized several names: leaders of countries with significant oil, mineral, and agricultural resources. "The proposal is simple," Traoré explained. "Russia provides technology transfer, industrial equipment, and security cooperation. In return, Africa provides guaranteed markets for Russian goods, alternative payment systems that bypass Western banking restrictions, and access to resources at fair market prices, not the exploitative rates that Western corporations have imposed for decades." Putin was beginning to understand the scope of what Traoré was proposing. This wasn't a typical aid request or modest trade agreement. It was a comprehensive strategy for breaking Western economic dominance by creating alternative global structures centered on Russian-African cooperation. "And the $20 billion? Putin asked. "Half would come from African sovereign wealth funds and development banks, invested directly in Russian industrial projects that benefit both our economies. The other half would be Russian investment in African infrastructure, but managed through African institutions to ensure genuine partnership rather than dependency." Putin studied the financial projections in the documents. The numbers were compelling and realistic. Unlike many development proposals he'd seen from African leaders, this one was based on solid economic analysis and clearly identified funding sources. "This is very different from what I expected," Putin admitted. "But I have to ask, why Russia? China is already heavily invested in Africa, and they can offer financing that we currently cannot match due to sanctions." Traoré's answer revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. "President Putin, China sees Africa as a source of raw materials and a market for Chinese manufactured goods. They build infrastructure, but they use Chinese workers, Chinese materials, and Chinese designs. The technology transfer is minimal, and the terms often favor China heavily." He leaned forward slightly. "Russia, on the other hand, has a history of genuinely collaborative relationships with African nations. During the Soviet era, Russia provided technical education, military training, and industrial development that built local capacity rather than dependency. Many of Africa's current leaders and technical experts were trained in Russian universities." Putin nodded slowly. He remembered the Soviet Union's African partnerships, which had been based more on ideological alignment and genuine development assistance than pure economic extraction. "More importantly," Traoré continued, "Russia is currently seeking to reduce its dependence on Western markets and financial systems. Africa is seeking to reduce its dependence on Western exploitation. Our interests are naturally aligned." The conversation continued for 3 hours, far beyond the scheduled 1-hour courtesy meeting. Putin found himself genuinely engaged with Traoré's vision and impressed by the African leader's sophisticated understanding of global economics and geopolitical strategy. As the meeting progressed, Putin's attitude toward Traoré, and by extension, toward Africa, underwent a fundamental transformation. He began to see the continent not as a collection of struggling nations seeking assistance, but as a potential equal partner with significant strategic value. "President Traoré," Putin said, as the formal discussion neared its end, "this proposal requires careful consideration by my economic team, but I want you to know that I'm impressed by the depth of analysis and the strategic vision you've presented." Traoré smiled. "I understand, President Putin, but before we conclude, there's one more element to discuss." He opened another folder and placed a single document on Putin's desk. It was a preliminary agreement for immediate cooperation worth $2 billion, designed to demonstrate the viability of the larger partnership. This smaller agreement would establish direct trade relationships between Russian agricultural and industrial companies and African partners, using a new payment system that bypasses Western banking restrictions entirely. We could implement this within 60 days, providing immediate relief from some of the economic pressure Russia is currently facing. Putin examined the agreement. It was precisely structured, legally sound, and offered genuine mutual benefit. Most importantly, it could be implemented quickly without requiring extensive bureaucratic approval processes. The African Development Bank has already allocated the funding, Traoré explained. Our partner countries have identified specific Russian products and technologies they want to purchase. The payment mechanisms are ready to be activated. Putin was genuinely surprised. This level of preparation and concrete readiness was unprecedented in his experience with African leaders. Most came with general requests for cooperation. Traoré had arrived with fully developed implementation plans. I have to admit, Putin said, I underestimated both you personally and Africa's capacity for this level of strategic planning. Many world leaders make that mistake. Traoré replied diplomatically. Africa has been portrayed as dependent and incapable for so long that even leaders who should know better sometimes accept that narrative. Putin stood up and walked to the window overlooking Red Square. The snow had stopped, and winter sunlight was illuminating the historic buildings. He was processing not just the specific proposal Traoré had presented, but the broader implications of what this meeting represented. President Traoré, I want to be direct with you. When this meeting was scheduled, I viewed it as a routine diplomatic courtesy. I expected to offer some general promises of cooperation and send you on your way with the standard photo opportunities. He turned back to face Traoré. Instead, you presented the most comprehensive and viable economic proposal I've received from any international partner in the past 2 years. You've demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and preparation that frankly surpasses what I've seen from many European leaders. Traoré remained seated, maintaining his composure despite the significance of Putin's admission. More than that, Putin continued, you've made me reconsider my assumptions about Africa's role in global affairs. If other African leaders possess similar capabilities and vision, then Russia has been overlooking enormous opportunities for genuine partnership. Putin returned to his desk and picked up the preliminary agreement. I'm prepared to sign this smaller agreement today as a demonstration of good faith while my team reviews the larger proposal. The significance of this moment was not lost on either leader. Putin was publicly acknowledging that he had underestimated Africa and was willing to immediately commit to a partnership based on equality rather than dominance. As Putin signed the agreement, he made an unprecedented gesture. He stood up and extended his hand to Traoré, treating him with the same respect he typically reserved for leaders of major powers. President Traoré, I look forward to continuing our partnership. You have opened my eyes to possibilities I hadn't previously considered. The meeting concluded with Putin personally escorting Traoré to the Kremlin's main entrance, a level of protocol typically reserved for heads of major powers. The Russian media, accustomed to covering routine African visits with minimal attention, suddenly found themselves documenting what appeared to be a significant shift in Russian-African relations. Within hours of the meeting's conclusion, Putin's economic advisors were analyzing the full $20 billion proposal with serious intent rather than diplomatic courtesy. The immediate $2 billion agreement was implemented within 3 weeks, providing Russia with badly needed access to African markets and Africa with Russian technology and industrial equipment. 6 months later, at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, Putin made a speech that shocked international observers. He publicly acknowledged that Russia had significantly underestimated Africa's strategic importance and leadership capabilities, and announced Russia's commitment to treating African nations as equal partners in reshaping global economic relationships. The transformation in Putin's attitude had ripple effects throughout Russian foreign policy. Other African leaders began receiving more serious consideration from Moscow, and Russia's African investments shifted from opportunistic resource extraction to genuine development partnerships. For Traoré, the meeting represented validation of his belief that African leaders could command respect on the global stage through preparation, strategic thinking, and concrete proposals rather than mere appeals for assistance. The $20 billion Russian-African alliance that emerged from that snowy December meeting in Moscow became a model for South-South cooperation that challenged Western assumptions about global economic relationships. It demonstrated that when African leaders approached international partnerships with confidence and sophisticated planning, even the most powerful world leaders took notice. Putin later told his advisors that the meeting with Traoré had been one of the most eye-opening diplomatic encounters of his presidency. He had entered the room expecting to manage a routine courtesy call and left it with a fundamentally changed perspective on Africa's potential role in global affairs. The alliance that began with that handshake in the Kremlin would eventually expand to include 15 African countries and represent over $50 billion in trade and investment relationships. It proved that when Africa was treated as an equal partner rather than a subordinate continent, the results could benefit all parties involved. Years later, when asked about the moment Putin's attitude toward him changed, Traoré would reflect, "Respect isn't something you can demand or request. It's something you earn through competence, preparation, and the confidence to offer partnership rather than seek charity." That day in Moscow, Africa didn't ask for respect. We demonstrated why we deserved it. The photograph of Putin and Traoré shaking hands in the Kremlin, both leaders standing as equals, became an iconic image of the changing dynamics in global diplomacy. It captured the moment when one of the world's most powerful leaders acknowledged that his assumptions about Africa had been wrong, and that the continent's time as an equal partner in global affairs had finally arrived. In the years that followed, other world leaders began approaching their meetings with African presidents with greater preparation and respect, understanding that the era of dismissive attitudes toward African leadership was ending. The meeting between Putin and Traoré had set a new standard for how major powers engaged with African nations, a standard based on mutual respect rather than condescending assistance. The $20 billion alliance that emerged from that winter day in Moscow proved that when African leaders came to international negotiations with sophisticated strategies and concrete proposals, they could reshape global relationships on their own terms. It was a lesson that would influence international diplomacy for generations to come.